let's look into data collection method and your selection of those as a major design decision. We won't delve into each data gathering procedure or method in a lot of detail here. That is kept for a separate session or separate sessions, but of course in the research design stage we have to think of how do we want to collect data and what kinds of data do we want to collect such that the objective of the research project can be achieved. And to just give you a first overview over data gathering modes, we would look at 3 different ways of data collection: observation, interviews, and text analysis. And those can either create numeric data for quantitative studies, other kinds of data, often textual data in qualitative studies, and we will examine recent trends that you should be aware of in this method and how it's applied. So let's first look at observation. There, if we want numeric data, we have different kinds of quantitative observation we can do. They are differentiated by the degree of participation of the researcher. So are you yourself a part of the process you're observing or not, and whether you're using some sort of apparatus, technical facility or apparatus, and if so, which one. For instance, you can do observations by eye tracking, or you can do observations by physiological measures, right? Or just without an apparatus, where you have an observation schedule where you enter your observations in numeric format. But very often observations are qualitative in nature, where you also differentiate by the degree of participation of the researcher, participatory or participant observation or non-participant observation, or by paradigm under which the observation occurs. For instance, ethnographic observations. Recent trends in the field is, of course, that we can do observations of online behavior in various forms, with or without some apparatus, and use those kinds of data. Okay. In the kinds of behaviors that are accessible online and where you can probably also be more likely to be a non-participant observer, where people aren't really aware of being observed, but that creates ethical challenges as well. Okay, and then we have interview studies that in numeric format take shape in form of quantitative surveys, which we subdivide by the population of interest we want to study. For instance, a general population survey or an expert survey or a decision maker survey, these kinds of things. You distinguish them by mode, for instance, whether you do the survey through the web, or you do telephone surveys or face-to-face interviewing, or by mail. And we distinguish it by design, so whether it's experimental or non-experimental, basically. When we go to non-numeric data, We're in the qualitative world usually, and we have different kinds of qualitative interviews, which differ by the number of participants in the interview. For instance, we have some things like focus groups that are group processes that are a part of the interview. We distinguish it by the degree of structure or protocol in the interview. For instance, to have a semi-structured interview or an unstructured interview. And we also distinguish by the epistemological function that the interview has. So do we want to get an expertise about something, then we want an expert interview. If we want to go into personal experiences, we want the in-depth interview, and so on. Of course, here also some recent trends are in conducting the interviews online, also video telephony, telephone, by Zoom and so on, and also on recruiting of interviewees through electronic channels, primarily social media and what that does. And there's, of course, advocates of online interviewing and recruiting online, but also many who are very skeptical towards that. Okay, and finally, we have text analysis, which in the numeric data world would be the quantitative content analysis, which we subdivide by whether it's done by human beings or done by some computer in an automated fashion, and any mixture of the two, semi-automated or computer assisted content analysis. And if we go into the automated or semi-automated text analysis procedures, we will subdivide or would subdivide into the specific procedure that is being done. So do we have a dictionary-based content analysis, or a topic model, or named entity recognition? I'll introduce you to those terms in a separate session. If we go non-numeric in the qualitative content analysis world, we would distinguish different kinds of qualitative content analysis. So prominent examples would be discourse analysis and document analysis. Here we have lots of recent developments that are very interesting. Strong trend to digitalization of text archives, be it parliamentary debates or that are accessible in many countries and can be examined using human or automated procedures. We have a stronger degree of digitalization and text-basedness of everyday happenings and conversations that we in principle could tap, but there's ethical considerations there as well, and an uptick in so-called data donation studies where people would cooperate with scientists and share, for instance, their social media profile with researchers, so they can examine these kinds of text data that pop up there. And of course, there is improvements and innovations in computational text mining procedures, so more and more tasks that the computer can help with or even take themselves in text analysis. Good. So that's a rough overview. Three main kinds of data gathering that we have in quantitative and qualitative versions, but that have lots of different variants and subdivisions, and not all of them would like to be listed as just another paradigm, say, of observation. That's also because there's paradigms, because there's research traditions mostly split by quantitative versus qualitative, but also within these research traditions there is sub-paradigms. Some examples: grounded theory, where you want to produce a highly domain-specific social psychological account or theory of something that is going on, which leads to purposive sampling, somewhat interview-centric sampling, and iterative back and forth processes between observations and theory building, involving constant case comparison. A very strong emphasis on inductive reasoning and inductive approaches, where initial theory doesn't play much of a role, but theory emerges from the research results. Then we have a paradigm that we could call phenomenology, where it's mostly centered on describing and understanding a subjective experience or account that predisposes this paradigm to doing in-depth interviews. We have two separate but related approaches in ethnography and ethnomethodology, which have the similarity in that they take an outsider perspective when exploring a social space. However, they are somewhat different in their interest and in how they do it. They both construct an everyday practical theory rather than a general theory of the field or the space they are studying. The focus of both is very much on context dependency and embeddedness and feedback between context and action. They focus on, or they prefer naturalistic methods with minimal intervention and a focus on authenticity because they want to get close to real life experiences. However, ethnomethodology is more focused on, so to say, strategies and methods people use to act within social reality, whereas ethnography has a more holistic focus on social norms and practices, and how people orient themselves in the social world. Then we have critical theory that has an added emphasis on bringing about social change and not only making descriptions. So normative thinking is very widespread, and taking strong stances is also more permissible among critical theory scholars. Challenging things that are often taken for granted are kind of something critical scholars want to do. So that's why they explore issues of power, inequality, and social injustice with methods such as critical discourse analysis. And finally, we have a school or paradigm of case study research that focuses on contextualization, thick description and understanding of the individual cases, and a very pragmatic approach with varied data gathering and methodology, which follows the demand of the situation or problem, and suggesting solutions for the case is often also emphasized. So the cases are also taken seriously themselves, not just as a mode of creating more general knowledge. They are also meaningful in themselves. More often than in other paradigms, a mixture of quantitative and qualitative approaches is used. Mixed methods is quite popular. probably less ideological than in qualitative research, paradigms also play a role. In quantitative research traditions, where some scholars typically use experimental designs because they have a strong emphasis on causality, internal validity, and are very concerned with that. Others prefer panel survey data if they are into surveys, because that's a good compromise between internal and external or ecological validity. But there's also scholars focusing on correlational studies and field studies that allow for more exploratory approaches, looking at descriptions and correlations rather than being very rigid about testing causality. So they would kind of more propose that some relationships might exist, and it's up to others to check the causality there. And we have comparative research, where these case selection techniques I introduced before play a large role. Good.